Remember the Aristotle notion with the right of conquest. So as this notion as the right of conquest as a definition of what makes someone a slave is chipped away at, the notion that you can do anything you want to with civilians also disappears. Now, in the ancient world, and in much of the literature we have, none of these sort of things apply. I just want to remind you what the biblical precedents for this are. And they're important because biblical precedents were important still in the minds of people who thought about what's right and wrong, maybe still today, but certainly in the 19th century. The Old Testament is not good on the rights of civilians and the rules of war. Far from it. So, as you remember, and some of you may not remember, but when Joshua conquered Jericho, he destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys, violating pretty much every precept of modern rules of war. Civilians, animals, property. Deuteronomy has the same kinds of precepts. So in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy is a particularly gruesome one where God instructs his soldiers that if the city that they're attacking doesn't accept Israel's offer of peace and open its gates, then when God delivers the city into the hands of the Israelites, which it's going to do, put to the sword all men in it without any regard. Do not leave anything that breathes. So that's the default. That is in some sense the default in a religious ethical tradition, which is important to the Christian ethical tradition of war. So you see, modern rules of war come from a situation very, very unlike what it turned out to be. The second important example I might suggest to you is this very famous episode in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars. It's often, maybe you guys some of you read this in Poli-Sci 1, because it's one of these, it's a standard sort of text of Realpolitik. So the Athenians are trying to convince the Melians to surrender because they want this territory for their empire. And the Melians say, "Look, we'll be your friends. We'll remain neutral. We're not going to do anything to harm you. We just want to live in peace with you, but we'd like to keep our independence, please." And the Athenians say, "Well, actually, we're the strongest, and we're asking you to give up your independence. And if you don't, we'll kill you." And it's a kind of totally cynical, wonderful dialogue. I mean, it's probably presented as a kind of conversation between innocence and politics. Well, the Melians don't give in to the Athenians, and the Athenians attack and surround them, and what happens is that the Athenians have told the Athenians that only the strong have a right to indulge in hope, and they're not the strong. And when the Melians finally did surrender after a siege, they put to death all the grown men, whom they took away, and then they sold the women and children to slaves, and then they cleared out everyone. So they cleared out everyone, and they moved 500 Greeks in and took over the place. Again, a violation of every notion that we have of the rules of war. So that's the kind of heritage from which the 16th and 17th century thinkers and the 19th and 20th century thinkers come. This is the deep Western tradition of how one deals with one's enemies. So, Grotius, whom you read some of the day, and who I'll come back to in a moment, is being the first to articulate a modern sort of notion of justice, of the just war, and of justice in war, also thought, look, there is a law of nature, and the law of nature lets you do essentially anything that you want. You got that from Locke. So we need to sort of say, Grotius' account is basically how we get out of a rule of nature. And finally, in this, I want to say a little bit, not finally, I got a little bit ahead of I want to say the modern example, Clausewitz. Clausewitz, again, if any of you take Rotzi, you'll read Clausewitz. He's the great modern theorist of war. And what's really interesting about Clausewitz, he's a Prussian general who writes what is still the most important book on theory of war. And what he says is sort of interesting. He says, look, you might believe that war can be civilized. You might say that speaking to the point we'll talk about next time, that civilized people fight wars for reasons, while savage people fight wars for passion. So that the war is really different between civilized people and savage people. And that civilized people have rules of war, but savage people don't, and therefore we should treat them in different ways. Possibly, sometimes, he says, civilized people act differently, but these things intrinsically, he says, don't belong to war itself. To introduce into the philosophy of war a principle of moderation would be an absurdity, he says. Even the most civilized nations may burn with passionate hatred and may act upon passionate hatred. So, what he's ended up saying then, we may end up thinking about the wars of a civilized nation as an intelligent act on the part of government, and to imagine it as continually freeing itself more and more from all feelings of passion in such a way, in some sense, that someday the last combatants can simply be acting as if they're playing chess. But he says, not true. War is in its intrinsic nature an act of passion. Act of politics too, but people engage in it as an act of passion, and in some sense it's not an algebraic action. It's not something that's easily moderated and controlled. So even in the sort of modern sense, when the laws of war begin to develop, there's a tension here, because in one sense, war is this incredibly violent act, and people engage in war, don't just act out of reason. But somehow the laws of war are asking people to act in the same ways they would in the normal civil jurisprudence and restrain violence according to certain rules, in conditions in which they're able to engage in this violence with actually less constraint. They're not being civil authorities and so forth. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest so far then is that there is a real tension here. And the final version of this is that even someone like Franz Lieber, whom I'm going to talk about in a moment, who writes the first American guide to the rules of war, terribly important in the origins of the Geneva Conventions, when he's talking about martial law, ends up saying to save the country is paramount to all considerations. So at some stage, there's a law of exception when anything goes. And what this laws of war and the ethics of war, this whole jurisprudence is trying to do, is push that back. You know? Is it try to say, yes, war is the state of exception, it is the state of legitimated violence, but in war there is justice. Nations can agree on what this justice is. We can hold people accountable. So the default, in some sense, is that anything goes. And the story we're going to tell now is the restriction on anything goes. So that's where I want to go from. That's where I want to go from here. Let me just. So let me go through these. Let me talk to you about these rules of war a little bit. So they begin really after what's called in European history, in world history, the military revolution of the 16th and 17th century. Military revolution is basically the scaling up of armies through infantry. With the invention of guns, weapons, the most effective weapon was no longer an expensive knight on horseback, but soldiers with muskets, which are much more easily multiplied. So much of the history of the early modern state, of the state in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, is a state which tries to raise taxes to create these large armies. So the size of armies multiplies with new technology. So in the 16th, 17th century, we have these huge new kinds of armies, gigantic, much larger than medieval armies. And there's a real issue for commanders to control these armies. So in some sense, the first disciplines, the first Western legal code for an army, which actually punished people for doing stuff wrong, is this so-called Swedish discipline of 1832 in the context of these series of religious wars in Europe in 1618 to 1648. The background of these, or the reason these passed, is not necessarily that that the Swedish king who had them written and promulgated them was such a great humanitarian in our sense. The reason is that